Well, that will be Aditya answering the questions. So I will get a row.
All right.
Right. You're going to have to... Yeah, right. Okay, I hope everybody can hear us. Is that clear? Because there's nothing more frustrating than being stuck at the back and unable. It's fine, okay. And, well, whether you can see us is less important, I think. I've been asked to plug the drinks reception, which comes immediately after this session, for those of you who by 6 o'clock are thinking about a drink. And I'm also told that it will require absolutely no effort whatsoever on your part, because we're going to be walked across in a schoolchildren type crocodile by Mark Banks, one of the conference organisers. So you're not going to get lost on your way to Portland Street and your drink. He's going to walk you across. And apart from the drinks, we also have a poetry performance by Mike Gary. And on this sheet of paper in front of me it says, he performs in prisons, mental health units, children's homes, and now the CRESC conference. It's my pleasure to introduce Aditya Chakrabortty, Guardian Economics leader writer and G2 columnist. And I think that when I say that, I think the first thing that strikes me is that Aditya doesn't really suit either role, really. And he's got a very distinctive voice, which those of you who read The Guardian will know. And I think he's not a proper leader writer, because a leader writer is someone who thinks that any public problem can be resolved in 800 words and a morning's work. And I think Aditya very much is interested in intractable problems. I think the most interesting stuff that he's done in the last couple of years is the work on deindustrialization, and particularly the lecture that he gave at Gateshead, which was broadcast on Radio 3. And apart from that, I suppose, apart from the leader writer, nobody knows who a leader writer is, but he's a G2 columnist, which means, of course, I suppose, he fits with Ask Hadley and Lost in Showbiz and all the rest of that stuff in G2, which is really, I suppose, tabloid interests garnished with a bit of irony and self-deprecation. And those of you who, like me, are deeply skeptical of that aspect of the modern Guardian will be pleased to find that Aditya really has a very different voice, because there's an element of distaste and puritanism behind labels like bankocracy, or in this week's column, Aditya, wealth extraction, wasn't it? It has an edge to it, which really most of the stuff in The Guardian, whether it's left or centre-left, really doesn't have. And I think that relates to a variety of things, including differences of social background. But he was therefore an obvious choice for the CRESC conference, and on promises. And how are we going to relate Aditya to promises? Well, I think we thought that basically we thought about the media, we thought about NGOs, we thought about academics, and we thought about the promises of engagement, criticism, relevance, and challenge, which are really part of the shtick of all those liberal professions. If you actually think about it, you can't have a salaried intelligentsia without a lot of mumbo-jumbo about how they are a key part of the political process, in a sense, through the ideas they contribute. And I think this isn't simply a matter of academic vanity or self-regard or media self-importance. There is something which is a thread that connects the media, the NGOs, and the academic world in terms of, you know, what an American would call their shtick, so to speak, the public line which justifies them. And I thought it'd be very interesting to have Aditya to talk about these promises of relevance, challenge, and criticism. Partly, of course, because he wrote that column last year, which slagged off academics and was completely ignored by the economists, Aditya, but got up the noses of organised sociology, didn't it? And also because I know that Aditya's view of the media, for example, are not exactly sunny and rosy, and because in the audience we have people from NGOs like Nick Hilliard and Larry from Corner House, or Silke, who when she's not wearing, Silke Otsch from Austria, who when she's not wearing her academic hat is an attack activist. And we've got people in the audience who are fairly skeptical of the games that NGOs play, so to speak. So I thought this would be a very interesting discussion. The promises made by our salaried intelligentsia in the liberal professions in and after the crisis. And the way we're going to structure it is, of course, we have to start by talking about what kind of crisis and why essentially our technical and political classes seem unable to fix it. And that's what Aditya and I are going to start talking of for 5 or 7 minutes. And then we're going to turn to Aditya talking solo on this question of, are we right to be disappointed with the response of the academics, the media, and the NGOs to the crisis so far? So let's start, Aditya. What kind of crisis? Economic, political, banking, finance? Take your pick.
First of all, can you hear me at the back again?
Yeah.
Okay. It's always really difficult to use terms of crisis and then say exactly what kind of crisis you mean, because the definition of crisis is that everything is up in the air, and that's part of what makes it such an interesting moment. Economically, just to focus on economics to begin with, and I think we should go to sort of politics and ideas as we go along. But economically, you can approach the question in one of 2 ways, I think. In terms of numbers, Britain has gone through the Great Recession of 2008-9 and had the worst recovery in the developed world, worse than America certainly, and worse even in the Eurozone, which is worth thinking about when you read about the Eurozone crisis. Our national income is still 6% per head below where it was in 2008. Our living standards are still set to be below, so the pay for the average worker is set to be below inflation up until 2017, 2018. So a decade of a squeeze on living standards, at least. And those are numbers. But the thing that strikes me is actually not so much the sense of crisis doesn't come through in the numbers so much, but when you talk to policymakers, because certainly when the coalition came to power, you used to see around the time a kind of a coalition, a wider coalition of people in the private sector, but also in the Bank of England, in the OBR, who would say that actually, this will be very tough, but we'll get through this. And as time's gone by, they've got less certain on that sense of we'll get through this. So if you look at the graphs that are produced by the Bank of England for what's going to happen to GDP, they usually have a kind of V shape. And they start, if you go back to looking at the inflation report that the Bank of England puts out every 3 months, there's a V that comes in, a very sharp dip, and then within 2 years the economy's gone back to normal. And all that's happened with each and every inflation report, you can do it as a kind of flick book if you like. Just get the same chart out and just flick it for the past 4 years. And you'll see that all that's happened is the V just keeps moving along. So the dip, there's a very sharp dip, and then 2 years later on there's a rebound. And all that's happened in Bank of England thinking is that the rebound is somehow deferred to 2 years hence. And what was notable last inflation report is that Mervyn King no longer officially holds this view that we will have a sharp rebound in 2 years' time. And if you talk to policymakers in the Bank of England, senior policymakers now, they'll tell you, whatever the official forecast will say, that now they're beginning to wonder about what whether we ever will have a significant rebound for the economy. Certainly some of the same sense of that you can get from the Treasury too, even from George Osborne's office. Obviously, there you get a much more political sense of things. So it's we're either having a really disappointing recovery because of structural problems in Britain, which is all the fault of Gordon Brown, or we're having a really disappointing cyclical recovery, which is all the fault of the Eurozone. So it's either bad Gordon or bad Angela, but never George Osborne's fault. But what you notice is a general sense of listlessness about what can be done now, which permeates our economic policy institutions. And I've only seen that close up once before, and that was when I went to Japan a couple of years ago, when you talk to people in government there or in the Bank of Japan, and you'd ask them, so you had 2 lost decades, you've thrown all this money at the economy, what happens next? And they would say, well, we just wait for something to turn up. And literally that, I think, is about as good a definition of what the Bank of England, what the Treasury policy is now. We wait for something to turn up.
So that in some sense we've run out of management techniques or run out of ideas? Are we basically bust in terms of ideas?
Well, I mean, I started off by talking about the policy institution because I wanted to talk about management. You look for kind of the governing ideas to be handed down to these people by people in politics, and I certainly think we are at the limits of what conventional management techniques have led our managers to believe they can do. So what you see is a complete loss of self-confidence, I think, now from people who set economic policy. But what I also notice is a complete lack of ideas about what can be done among politicians too. The obvious examples that you see this week, right, with the reshuffle, when you have supposedly a pro-growth cabinet, and George Osborne now sits on something called a growth commission, which I don't know what that's meant to do, but apparently it's just meant to knock down any remaining obstacles to growth that remain, as long as they're in the fields of either planning or employment regulation. And then, somehow the salvation for the British economy will lie in a third runway at Heathrow, somehow. And so you see all these kinds of discussion of what at the most optimistic you describe supply side reform during the middle of what's a quite sharp drop in aggregate demand in the economy, when people just aren't willing to spend, whether they're shoppers or whether they're businesses looking to make investment decisions, or whether they're parts of the public sector thinking about whether to refurb that, that knackered part of school buildings or whatever. You certainly see that in the coalition. But the other thing that really, really strikes me, and is really very, very funny, is the Labour response to this, where you have a sense, I think, in Labour that something's up. The economy they were in charge of for 13 years, after all, there were pretty serious problems with that. And that actually you can try and throw 325 billion or 350 billion pounds worth of quantitative easing at the problem, and you can try and encourage banks to lend, although it's only ever encouraging banks to lend, never doing much more than that. You can even give them actually a bit of taxpayer money to lend to businesses, but you can't do much more than that. But Labour, I think, sus that there's something deeper at work. And one of the ways I sometimes think about this is, if you were to read what most of the political journalism about this moment consists of, it's as if there's just a straightforward argument between cuts and no cuts. But actually, you could do a different argument, which would run right down the diagonal of the party political system, which would be structural change or no structural change. And on the one side, you've got the right of the Tory party that want very, very sharp structural change, that want, effectively a lot of cutting and slashing of the welfare state, of labour laws, labour protection, and so on and so forth. And on the other side, on the Labour side, you've got people like Ed Miliband, Maurice Glassman, John Cruddas, who talk a bit about inequality, about the fact that middle-income workers haven't seen much of the gains from the boom, and are certainly seeing nothing in the bust, who talk a bit about the loss of industry. And they're on one side of the argument in the Labour Party, and on the other side of the argument, there are people like Ed Balls, Yvette Cooper, a lot of the Blairites, who don't see anything being, who just basically don't think there was that much wrong in the British economy between 1997 and 2010. And the problem that you've got there on the Labour side, and you see it really clearly between Ed Balls and Ed Miliband, you know, kind of a battle of two Eds, is that on the one hand you've got people like Ed Balls who can read a Treasury Red Book. You know, he can look at Treasury Red Book, he can look at the tables, he can tell you what's going on. He can read a spreadsheet, and he's up against Ed Miliband, who's read a bit of Aristotle. And that's not really a fair fight. I think boxing authorities have got some kind of regulation where if you've got two fighters and one's clearly at a lower weight than the other one, then they just don't get in the ring. And you sometimes see this, you know, Ed Miliband goes into a room, he talks about, you know, he refers to John Rawls, he refers to inequality, he refers to the need for reciprocity, whatever that may mean. And that's about it. And that doesn't really get you very far in dealing with current economic problems. And on the other hand, you've got the people who were in the Treasury for 13 years, and they know all the numbers, but they've got nothing else.
Yeah.
And I think that's, when you look at Westminster politics, you just get a sense of really quite small arguments. Sometimes, you know, sometimes hilariously small arguments, but all done within a bubble, all done without a sense of what goes on outside Westminster or London, and without much sort of new to say about any of these problems.
I mean, we will come to, you can no doubt be rude about the media and academics later, but you're being fairly rude about the political classes and their civil servants, aren't you, basically? I mean, because, I mean, essentially the world you portray is the Iannucci world of in the thick of it, isn't it? A world of kind of self-reference, rolling news, DOSAC and all the rest of it.
I think it's worse than that, actually. If you were to, right, so I'll give you a couple of examples. I think Labour at the party conference season and in the run-up to elections will go very big on this idea about rebuilding a broken Britain, and they'll talk about broken, you know, political system, broken economic system, and so on and so forth. And it will sound great in the first party conference speech that Ed Miliband makes. It will sound very convincing and it will resonate, I'm sure, in the same way as Osborne talking about the need to rebalance the economy sort of had some kind of truth to it. But there won't be very much that goes alongside that. And the reason why I say that with some degree of certainty is because Labour been sort of holding all kinds of meetings through their policy review group. One of the issues they want to really deal with is how to get the private sector to be more dynamic and employ more people and pay them better wages and all the rest of it. And so they're having these big meetings with senior Labour people and experts. And I got sent a list of the people who they wanted to invite for the panellists for one of these meetings. And so you see an economist, Jonathan Portes from National Institute. That's fine. You know, he talks a lot about these sorts of issues. That's fine. He's there. Who's their main business person? It's the CEO of Greggs. So why is CEO of Greggs on a thing about how to build a more dynamic private sector economy? Why would you not have someone from Rolls-Royce or whoever? Because he's been on telly a lot. But he's been on telly a lot talking about pasties and VAT. Yeah, but he talks a lot, right? And that's literally the conversation that you have. It's that thing. This week, Labour's going to have Ed Miliband is going to have a big meeting on a day-long thing on the future of the economy and where Labour should stand on it. And it will just consist of a mess of names of people, just anyone who talks about economics will be able to go along and take part in the panel. They've no clue about where even they reach for these ideas. You know, the CEO of Greggs somehow is equivalent to, his opinion is just as relevant, just as vital to them as anyone else's.
And the implication of that is that our political classes would be capable of managing or taking the credit for a capitalism that worked, but they're not capable of, and have no techniques, have no practice, which is adequate to a capitalism that's not working very satisfactorily. Is that so?
Well, you can. I mean, particularly in the case of Labour, but I think this applies to all the main parties. Is essentially for 13 years they didn't have to worry about the economy very much. I mean, or a bit less than that, maybe the best part of a decade. They didn't have to worry about the economy.
Which was the Cameron-Osborne assumption
Yeah.
in the early years
Exactly
when they were in
right.
opposition.
So Cameron's big thing when he took over was that he would share the proceeds of growth, because the assumption was there would be plenty of growth to go around, and all he'd do would be trim back public spending a bit. But that's not only an intellectual problem, there's also a personnel problem there, because what that meant was effectively all three parties, especially Labour and the Conservative Party, outsourced their economic thinking to two men, Gordon Brown and Ed Balls. The assumption was that they had it, they'd sussed it, they'd licked it. And Labour certainly now, when you look at who, Ed Balls is still there. Ed Miliband has got no one who can act as kind of an oppositional force to Ed Balls. There's no one who knows the numbers, there's no one else who knows the policies, there's no one who knows who to ring. You're left with CEO of CRESC.
Yes. What about the think tanks?
Yeah.
Really, deeply depressed that CRESC has not been nominated for the think tank of the year in the CRESC in the annual awards organised by Prospect, which I follow with great hope each year.
The last chap who won the think tank of the year was from Social Market Foundation, and you got a sense that it wasn't really a proper award because he turned up to collect the award wearing a tank top. Makes me think there's some sort of Mickey Mouse about it. The think tanks are there to design policies for people in power, and they are used to fly kites by political parties, and if they're smart they'll get a bit of private sector funding, or they'll grub around for a bit of money, and they'll come up with some ideas that are workable. Yeah. But it's all within the realms of workable. And what's the point of thinking about the workable when things aren't working?
Right. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, you've got people whose imaginations are limited to the workable and things aren't working. Right. Let's turn to the media and the NGOs and the academics. Now, what's your pitch there, Aditya? Do you want to start with the media? Because it'd probably be best if you're...
if I start with...
Yes, a bit of self-excoriation always goes down very well in these circumstances.
Like a sheer ceremony.
More or less, yes.
I sort of think, actually, the media are the worst of your problems, because they're in a way that they are symptomatic of what else is going wrong. So if you have if you have political parties who don't differ from each other significantly and are still all reaching around for ideas, and you've got think tanks who are in a state of confusion, and you don't have that much in the way of ideas coming from other people, then you're going to get a media which is pretty limited in its own discussion of these issues. I think where the media has been good in this country is that they've sussed there's a problem. So even the FT, straight after the financial crisis, talked about this being a crisis of capitalism.
For about 8 weeks.
This is the problem. Well, this is precisely the problem, because actually, if you look at what happens on media discussion of issues, is they actually do discuss issues very fervently, but for very short periods of time. So I remember I once talked at a CRESC conference that you did with anthropologists, and I came to talk about media, and I looked at the figures on media discussion of securitisation, and before 2007 there was nearly nothing. 2 or 3 articles buried in the back of the FT, largely due to Japan. Then all of a sudden, from 2007 to 2009, a whole burst of stuff, and then from 2009 onwards, a real sharp drop-off. I checked that the other day. There was barely any mention of 2012, our discussion of securitisation, which surely lies at the heart of the banking crisis. Our discussion of securitisation in the public press is as minimal as it was in 2006. I did the same thing for Keynes and Keynesianism actually recently, because I was interested to see what would have happened to this Keynesian moment that we were meant to be going through in 2008 and 9. And the same thing happens. Before 2006, barely any mention of the old man. 2008, 9, something everywhere, and not just in the Guardian, the FT, but everywhere across the press. 2010 on, the figures start to drop quite sharply, and now again, you're not left with very much apart from in the Guardian and the FT. So what they do is they pick up on problems, but then if there's no sustaining force behind them, the media don't tend to provide that sustainable. So they've always seen their role as kind of interlocutors rather than as kind of people who actually drive things.
And that's tied in with the culture and organisation of the British press. I mean, you know, kind of Harold Evans is venerated, but you know, how many years since the Insight thing at the Sunday Times? I mean, there's a lot of emphasis, even in the Guardian and the FT, on packaging things very quickly.
Yeah, but I think that's I give them less of a hard time on that because I think that's natural. You know, you want to report news and you want to be current and all the rest of it. What I think and the other thing I would say also in defence of the press, or rather just in my paper, is it does do some quite good things which take a long time to come to fruition. And the Murdoch case is that, you know, terribly risky story to run. They kept running, despite all kinds of threats against both the corporation and the people who were editing the paper, and then it came to fruition. So they can do things like that from time to time. But the big issue with something as complex as the economic crisis or the financial crisis is, how do you keep making that current? You know, who drives that?
Yeah. Yeah, that also explains the paradox of the Guardian being, you know, so strongly sort of kind of socially liberal,
yes,
libertarian,
yeah.
And you know, between ourselves, a bit confused as to either its economic line or who you should vote for at the next election.
No, I don't think it's confused. I think it had a line which was not one I agree with, but it had a line which I could see, which was it wanted to take part in this kind of creation of the centre ground in 2009 and 10, which was socially liberal, economically not that bothered, you know, no real thought given to that. It was kind of, you know, the policies of Nick Clegg, David Cameron, but not George Osborne, not Vince Cable. A bit like the FDP in Germany. You know, they wanted markets to work, but you know, they didn't want monopolies in them. They wanted people to have, you know, rights. That was basically it. And actually, one of the things that you've seen happen is that centre ground, that kind of new, rather sort of tender centre ground, has broken apart in the last, you know, few months in Westminster, which leaves the Guardian looking very confused now.
Right. Okay. Let's turn to the NGOs and the academics. Do you want to do the NGOs first? Are they anywhere in your cosmology of villains, so to speak? Or inadequates, really? I mean, I think essentially, I mean, the situation dwarfs people's imagination. That's the common thread, isn't it?
No, I don't think that. I think you're obviously trying to get me to make out.
Surely not.
It's a play in which the entire cast is pygmies, and I actually sort of think that, but I also think that there is just a more serious problem, which is this, you know, however you want to term the left, for want of a better word, has been in a recession for a long, long time, for decades now. And so, if you look at the media, you know, this sense of papers which knew where they stood on either side of the line, that's obviously gone away, and the Guardian's been part of that. That's why it's been part of this, you know, new centre ground. The NGOs are really part of that, because the NGOs actually paradoxically had a huge amount of success, especially in development, in 2005, and once again in climate change, you know, in the dying years of New Labour. So they did very well, but the problem is they then got co-opted into the political process, so you're left with this ridiculous thing where there's a hunger summit at Downing Street, and all the NGOs play a secondary role to Mo Farah. And they are, and all development and aid and that entire, you know, what you do about, you know, poor developing countries within the economic system becomes boiled down to one word, which is hunger, which is, you know, the most neutered response you can come up with. This is all about giving money to the poorest people who can't afford to feed themselves, and nothing else besides that. I don't think people within the NGO movement are, you know, most people I know, they do think more broadly than that. They think much more broadly than that. But where I would hold them to account is I think they've been slow on the uptake of thinking about how far these problems are now over in the West. So for a long time it used to be the enemies were the IMF, World Bank, the vulture funds who came in and bought the debt dirt cheap and then, you know, shook down the third world governments. Well, what do you do in a system where it's very clear now that the bankers are over here and that actually IMF-style programs are being enforced in Southern Europe? What do you do then?
Yeah, right.
And that's where the NGOs have been slow. And one of the things I've noticed that people within the NGO movement are now trying to think more seriously about banks over here. So they now have meetings which they, but it's all late in the day.
Yes. Though it needs to be said that if you have any kind of major crisis which shifts from an apparently functioning economy to extreme dysfunction and malfunction, it takes quite a period of time for people to sort of kind of sort themselves out, doesn't it? I mean, if you look at the experience of post 29, the thing rumbles on. People are making massive policy mistakes in 31, 32. It's 1936 before Keynes publishes the general theory. I mean, there's also a requirement. People do need time, don't they, Aditya?
Yeah, but by the early 30s you had Roosevelt.
Yes.
You had Glass-Steagall. 33.
Well, that's the regulatory response.
It's more than a regulatory response. That's also a clear political divide on. I'm no longer going to be dealing with these bankers on the same terms of trade as they used to.
And we don't have that now because of the collapse of the left, because of the changes in politics.
Because you do not, because our sense, our imagination, our imaginary, what is possible. Who should we be, who is important within this configuration? That's now so limited and so confused. And we've got used to, thinking about, bank, in the case of the NGOs, thinking about banks as being people who do bad things over there, in Africa or Latin America, not over here.
Right, let's come round to the academics.
Fundamental problems, need for serious thought. Why can't this group of the liberal intelligentsia do the business?
I really wanted to sort of talk about this, largely because I asked a few people, Liz McFall, Dave O'Brien, Chris Roberts, I asked them what I want to talk about, and in their various ways they all talked about this thing about the academics, largely because I wrote those two pieces, I suppose. And I actually think I'd be really interested in knowing what other people think of this. From my perspective, which is obviously as somebody who isn't an academic, but takes an interest in what academics do and reads what they do and tries to bring them into kind of what I write about and bring them into the fold of my paper. I suppose the problem that you've got within Westminster people who can't even see what the problems are, let alone what solutions are. And they are turning to their source of expertise, well, not just the chap who makes pasties, but also economists who were there before the past and therefore do not see anything wrong in the economy as it stood in 2006.
Yeah.
And so what I think I've been disappointed in is the lack of serious work done by non-economists into how we got to this present situation. Whether that's to do with bankers and the role that they've played in perverting the economy, but also the stranglehold they now have on politics. Or whether it's just the wider problems about why is it that certain groups within Britain have been locked out of political processes, how that's happened. I think when I wrote those two pieces, I think that's what I was really trying to say, was that actually you can't really turn to economists to go around giving you the answers to the questions which they weren't able to spot the first time round. If you look at Labour, just to go back to Labour, Ed Balls is advised by people who see nothing wrong with the economy as it stood in 2006. In fact, their entire pitch is the economy as it stood in 2006 was absolutely fine. All we need to do is spend a bit more money, we'll be back there. If you
Well, that's the line of...
just the line of John Portes.
I've debated with him in public.
Exactly. Everything was fine. All we need now is to wave the Keynesian wand and we'll go back to 2006.
Yes.
As if that was all, perfectly fine. And what I think we really badly need, are people who say, well, actually, the way things stood in 2006, 2007, and from then on, was actually pretty imperfect. And here are the reasons why, and here are the sort of things that we ought to be thinking about. Not at the level of necessarily just coming up with policy prescriptions, but a more sustained analysis. Because don't forget, one of the reasons why the Bank of England's inflation report keeps deferring this rebound is because the models the Bank of England still use after crisis, assume that the financial system always clears. So this is why they always assume that there will be a rebound 2 years hence. Because they still see the bank system essentially neutral, as just a conduit for money.
How much can academics do if you have, I love there's a 1930s Spender poem where he talks about the church blocking out the light in a very kind of, radical Marxism. I mean, surely the economists, from your and my point of view, are the church blocking out the light. I mean, this is actually quite an interesting point. If you have someone like, Ismail Bertolt, for example, who knows a lot more about banking than Jonathan Portes.
Yeah.
I mean, Portes is director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and Ismail, struggles to get a hearing. Isn't there a problem that you pass over, you shift from the reactionary economists and then jump to actually requiring the rest of us, i.e. the people in this room, to manage superhuman feats?
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism, except that I sometimes, I suppose what I wondered when I was writing those pieces, and what I still wonder now, is how much appetite there is to go up, on the part of the academics to go after those questions. Whether it's not just a question of the church blocking the light, but also people thinking, actually, I shouldn't go anywhere near the church.
Yes.
And part of that is political. So there are very good economists who no longer are allowed into economics faculties, yes. Quite obviously. Take a really, really obvious striking example. Ha-Joon Chang, who is probably one of the most renowned left-wing economists in Britain, doesn't teach in the Cambridge Economics faculty and isn't allowed to teach development studies in the economics faculty. He teaches in development.